Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 44. You are trapped in history with me, your host, Robbie Malcolmson. In this episode tonight, we are going to directly address some of the major topics in Unit 6, the industrialization and its effects in AP European history. If you're not interested in the Industrial Revolution or you're not taking an AP class, I can completely understand if you might want to skip this episode. I'm kind of doing this episode special for my students that are in class. But if you're interested in the topic, you still may find a connection to this. So first I want to start this by contextualizing the beginning of the unit. Remember that we finished Unit 5 before Christmas break. We had concluded with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the end of Napoleon there at Waterloo. And in 1815, he will be exiled for the last time to the island of St. Helena. The year before that, though, the European powers had already started under his first exile looking for some solution for the future. And so they met at this meeting called the Congress of Vienna. There's going to be several meetings, and some of them even more of a ballroom dancing kind of party format of this. But especially whenever Napoleon came back for his 100 Days campaign, tried to retake over places again, the European powers, many of them, lured him into Waterloo, and then he was able to destroy his military there and then exile him for the final time. And this is where the conservatives in Europe really wanted to push strongly for an aggressive solution to the future, mainly to prevent any other kind of Napoleons again, like dictators like that, but more specifically and importantly, to reestablish boundaries in Europe again. After Napoleon had ruled the majority of Europe, him and some of his brothers and other people that he had used through nepotism to put into power in those areas. You also have the fallout of the Holy Roman Empire because of Napoleon. So many of these territories in Europe have to be restructured. And some of these territories do not get much of a say either. For example, like Poland some of that territory will be just given over to Russia. So it's not necessarily that Congress of Vienna will be a perfect solution. But the main goal here to remember from the point of view as a student is to reestablish boundaries, kind of balance out Europe again after Napoleon's rule, and also to restore traditional monarchies. Because many of these conservative thinkers that led the Congress of Vienna, people like Clemens von Metternich, that was your Austrian leader and political influencer of this meeting, and along with many others, but Metternich was also not a fan of Napoleon at all either. But many of these conservatives, as you know, they want to maintain the status quo. Many of them saw the solution, the remedy to take care of this chaos that was brought in by the French Revolution, by the reign of Napoleon, was the best solution for that is to bring back traditional monarchies. And as we'll see through the rest of the 1800s, that's not going to work out greatly either, especially for places like France, who will have some revolution again as well too. And by the 20th century, we'll see the majority of the monarchies removed and replaced with more democratic sort of styles of government led by prime ministers and different leaders like that. But you're still going to have into World War I like a Kaiser in Germany, and you're going to have a Tsar in Russia. So there'll still be some remnants into the first part of the 20th century as well. Now, at the Congress of Vienna, the European powers did establish sort of a new alliance, a loose agreement of alliances called the Concert of Europe. I would not consider this much different than the League of Nations later, and not as strong as the United Nations is today. But the Concert of Europe was also supposed to maintain this peace in Europe and prevent war for as long as it could. And this lasted decent until at least we get into the Franco-Prussian War, but it most certainly gets destroyed by the time we get to World War I in 1914. Now, with that context, that sets up this next topic here. So technically, this unit starts in 1815 when the Congress of Vienna takes place. But you could say the Industrial Revolution goes all the way back to maybe at least 1764-ish, in which James Watt invents the steam engine. And as that becomes more regularly used and throughout that, we kind of usher in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the first wave, predominantly with that steam engine. We get a second wave of industrialization too. But let's go back a little bit and take a look at one of those earlier units of the school year in which we covered a topic called the Agricultural Revolution. And within that Agricultural Revolution, with these new methods going on, we started to see the rise of this new movement referred to, as we discussed in class, called the enclosure movement. And this enclosure movement will take a lot of these small family-sized kind of plot farms that were used to mainly farm for themselves and their local community, and they will be consolidated and bought out by larger commercial farms, and then they will be enclosed by walls or hedgerows and whatnot. And now that will create a problem in many of these villages. And we looked at a particular village of a diagram in Appleby, England, and many of these families now that did have these small plots of land in these rural areas will now have to make a difficult decision of moving to the cities. And this is part of a very important process for the AP test and AP topics called urbanization. So we could say that the enclosure movement, along with many other causes that we do not mention in this class, led to population migration towards cities and urban centers. And within these cities, people are mainly moving there to find job opportunities. And they could find these in the factories and underground in the mines and merchant scenarios on docks, different kind of places like this. But these people will move to these cities. Again, these cities are not necessarily ready for this massive influx of people over this 100 to a 150 year time period. And many of these cities, of course, were established and built there during the Middle Ages. So there's a lot of overpopulation problems, significant claustrophobic sort of proximity that they're living together. We looked at a Gustave Doré drawing of over London by rail, which I plan on having on the test as well. You see the nature of these people who are living together. They're living in squalor, basically, too. These places are very dirty. They throw their waste outside into the alleys. The hygiene is just not well. So these environments where they're closely packed in, these living environments, it leaves working class people exposed to massive amounts of pollution through the air and through the water. That also exposes them to disease. We also discussed some of these diseases like cholera and yellow fever, tuberculosis, many of these different types that have a similar impact on society that we saw like smallpox did earlier in the school year. So this just kind of sets up them going to the city. So this process of urbanization is referred to as cities physically getting bigger, and you can see that through our diagrams in like Manchester, for example, but also a large influx of people, a significant influx of people moving to these cities. So of course the standard of living in these cities will not be ideal, and the people will be living in slums or tenements, whatever you would like to refer to them as, and they will be also often working near where they live at. And if they don't, then they can hop on a streetcar, they can ride a bike, they can also walk to these kind of jobs. And the working conditions, as we discussed in class, are not much better either. And I would say maybe even worse on that. Many of these children from as young as 6 years old, all the way up through adults, women, men, they're all working, usually 12 to 16 hours a day. Factory owners are trying to get as much profit out of them as they can. No regulations or reforms yet created at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and this urbanization to really police and oversight these factory owners. So we have problems of long hours and low wages and unsafe working conditions. And this was illustrated in many of the photographs that we've seen in class and some of the drawings that we had. Another one of the drawings that I really appreciated us going over in class was the Christmas Carol, the Scrooge standing in front of Tiny Tim and his friend with the ghost of Christmas present in the background, almost establishing this archetype of like the wealthy owner, this bourgeois sort of owner, mistreating and taking advantage and exploiting the proletariat, the working class sort of individuals, and the ghost of Christmas present being there to further show that these changes need to happen now, not in the future, not in the past. So as the Industrial Revolution continues on, we start to see this ushering in of changes, and that's mainly done through reform movements. And in the working environment, we start to see labor unions formed, and there are many names that go with social groups and reform groups and labor unions, but mainly to know that labor unions are groups of workers that organize themselves together, create a leadership, and then they are meant to negotiate with the factory owners for better wages, shorter hours, better, safer conditions to be able to work in. And over the course of time, this will work well, but this will have extreme opposition from especially the factory owners and other people as this is going. Not to mention just the tension between people working with all the different people fighting for jobs. There will also be the Sunday school movement that we discussed earlier that could be pushing for public education, ways of getting more children out of the mines, out of the factories, into a better setting for their growth, both physical and mental. And the Sunday school movement's great for that. We see people like Flora Tristan as a socialist writer writing about the working conditions up in England. We see people like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham with utilitarianism arguing for better conditions in these urban environments, the working conditions, but even arguing for more opportunities for women. And that could benefit the society as a whole, hence the whole meaning of utilitarianism, about benefiting the majority of society. So we do see the conclusion now, for the most part, of first wave feminism with Flora Tristan, the Pankhurst family, whether they have militant methods or they don't. We see this first wave feminism, which we kind of started with Mary Wollstonecraft, went through Florence Nightingale and many other people as well, Marquis de Condorcet, other people as well too, that we discussed, really helped push opportunities for women in education, eventually into women's suffrage. We saw property rights for women and divorce rights, all these things if you're trying to get into more writing ability. Now, something we didn't discuss as much this unit was the Irish potato famine in the Hungry 40s. It didn't really fit with the flow of what we're doing, but we're going to come back at the end of the school year and really hit on that. And other than that, to really kind of go more of a macro level again before we wrap up this shorter sort of review podcast, think about the map of Europe and where it starts at. The Industrial Revolution, it started in Great Britain for a reason, because Britain is ideal. It has an abundance of natural resources. It has a significant amount of rivers. It's an island. It's surrounded by water. And Great Britain is still at the height of their empire at this point in time, too. They're going around the world and imperializing, which we will see more in Unit 7 coming up pretty soon. It's like an extension on to this particular unit. And many of the British, they're going out and trying to seek for more raw materials for their factories and their industries back at home. And this is going to create where this kind of starts at. And the map that we'll see in class basically contributes it to around 1820. You can say maybe it starts a little bit earlier there. But more importantly to know is that England and France really get the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and they get more of an advantage. It's another reason why when we get to the scramble of Africa in Unit 7, that we see a significant amount of territory gained by France and Great Britain there and around the world in places like India and other places, because they have quite more of an advantage in industrialization than most of these other countries in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, for sure. But another topic to transition to that goes well with this is that we can go to somewhere like Prussia. So we go to what's going to be in the future in Unit 7 is going to be Germany unified. In this unit, we call it Prussian industrialization. And they are going to start finally industrializing in order to keep up with people or with countries and powers like Great Britain and France. And with the help of the Krupp family, Germany or the German states will be able to further industrialize. And then writers like Frederick List in his economic system book that he writes, that will have that on test, his national system of political economy, almost like an Adam Smith type of figure for the Germans. And if you combine Frederick List and the Krupp family together, we really get Prussia industrializing and also doing it under a new policy called Zollverein, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, then I apologize. And Zollverein really just means free trade between the German states. And we can think of the old German states within the Holy Roman Empire, many of these segregated states together. It's not working out really well because it makes it even easier for leaders like Napoleon to be able to conquer those kind of areas. You don't have this unified nation-state identity yet that we will see in Germany and Italy in Unit 7. So this is a great foreshadow for that, because the industrialization, the westernization in Germany there will further help in the future for individuals like Otto von Bismarck and Wilhelm I and others to unify Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. So this gets the states to trade with each other, not placing tariffs on each other. And that way it's more of collectively boosting all of their economies as they're going. In a weird way, it kind of reminds me slightly like NAFTA in the 1990s between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Kind of this deal to sort of help all three countries that are together and close to each other to benefit their economy. Now, to be able to kind of wipe up the rest of this chapter here, just know that there's certain themes to really kind of consider. Is that anytime you see the word reform, it doesn't matter what kind of labor union group it is, what kind of women's group it is, or education group it is. It doesn't matter if it's temperance with banning alcohol, or it is abolitionist like banning slavery. But reform seeks change. And that tends to lean more liberal. And we see these liberal categories like utopianism, socialism together, communism, a more extreme connected version of socialism that is started by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. We see that book that's extremely important, published in 1849 by Karl Marx and Engels, called the Communist Manifesto. Probably one of the most famous books in world history. In our last book of the school year that you really have to know by name for certain. There's some books there in Unit 7 that you can get to, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with Romanticism and other topics like that. But it is one of the most important books of the school year. But nonetheless, reform is really going to go into change. And it kind of goes back to this dichotomy between, this difference between liberals and conservatives. And conservatives you may have on the exam, people like Edmund Burke from Britain, people like Metternich from Austria, that are going to be seeking to maintain status quo, maintain traditional governments like the monarchies. Liberals, on the other hand, as we saw from the French Revolution to now, they are more liking a change. You're going to see people that kind of get into much more radical forms of liberalism like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, but you might get a little bit more, it's radical, but it's a little bit more tamed down like Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill as far as utilitarianism goes too. Flora Tristan's a little bit more moderate in terms of feminism, but the Pankhurst family is extremely militant. So Emmeline and her 4 daughters are extremely aggressive when it comes to earning more rights for women. Now, to wrap up some of the main other topics, don't forget that we had recently covered capitalism in Unit 4 with Adam Smith and getting to free market societies. But the problem here is that with industrialization and the breaking down of the feudal system and getting in new classes like the middle class and the working class coming in, we have these new segregated, not really segregated, but different sections of society that are connected together. And yet we still see like large numbers of poor people, large numbers in poverty, small number of people at the top of the sort of triangle or wedding cake diagram, so to speak, that are consolidated with more wealth. And we see some of these problems in our country today with capitalism. So of course, the response to this is this rise of socialism, this idea of a shared sort of economy. We get a utopian socialism, this idealistic way of being able to look at that. But ultimately, because of these kind of groups here, even though they're not necessarily successful in terms of taking over government, they do help push forward a lot of reforms that will eventually do things like reduce and then remove child labor entirely and create compensatory education. It does lead to radical movements of social issues where we see in the revolutions of 1848 happen that are not successful, but they were attempts to overthrow a lot of the traditional monarchies. But we see a lot of unrest in the 1800s as many working class people and middle class butt heads, or they struggle with each other for establishment in these European countries in an era where there's significant technological change and globalization that is taking place. We see reform movements like the temperance movement, the abolitionist movement going on. All of these are really help make this unit more complex. But to finish up the podcast tonight, I really want to focus on the 3 acts that are good to know too for the AP exam. I have a feeling that at least one of these will be used on the test this year. One of them would be the Factory Act of 1833. It's also on our DBQ essay. And this is really one of the first attempts in Britain to reduce the amount of hours for children and women working in these factories per day and per week for those things. So it's another step in the right direction. The problem with the 1833 Act, that there was not oversight and proper strict I guess you would say policing of these on the factory owners. So in many of these instances, there'll be further abuse, and we see other studies done of this later to show that many of these factory owners are abusing it. So then there's another Factory Act that is established and enacted in 1844 that is meant to be more of an aggressive take on that. Then we get the 10 Hours Act there. I guess it should go in chronological order. We have the Mines Act of 1842 that happens. This is more clear cut. This explicitly takes women and children out of the mines entirely, leaving only males to be working in there. And then we have the 10 Hours Act in 1847 that will reduce the amount of hours worked during the day to 10 hours, especially for women as well and the children. We kind of see this pushing back of more of this this modern sort of society look, this more traditional outlook, maybe towards females of not being at the work as much, maybe having more of a nurturing role. But I would say all the way up into World War One, though, females are going to be working in many of these other more masculine sort of jobs, but children are going to be going to more of education. Don't forget, some of the best visuals that you could use for this unit are punch cartoons, a satirical cartoon journal that was used in England that has a critical view of the upper class, the government, and a more sympathetic view towards the working class. And this is really kind of where we're wrapping this sort of unit up here. But just don't forget, of course, there might be some small topics that I'm overlooking here a little bit that we'll come back at the end of the school year and address as well. But this gives a general overview. So hopefully in 20 or 25 minutes, you're able to listen to this podcast, feel as though you have a better contextualization of what leads to this particular time period, but also you have a better idea of what the beginning or maybe the first Industrial Revolution and into the second one looks like as we're getting closer to World War One. And I know that we could do a podcast for 2 or 3 hours on this particular kind of topic, and that might be something in the future we'll come back and really hit these specific topics over the years and do great deep dive episodes on it. But this is supposed to be more of a review for industrialization and its effects. And hopefully this helped many of you get that idea to help you for the test tomorrow. Don't forget other little kind of side things tomorrow, even though it's not on the test. Don't forget about the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851 in England in Hyde Park, a way for Britain to further show off their technology, even the building itself being mostly made of steel and glass to be used for that one. So it's just little kind of events like that. Also, the type of art used in this unit is still Romanticism, although we really won't hit on Romanticism and realism hard until Unit 7. Unit 7 will also be 1815 to 1914, and we're going to be delving into more of the cultural aspect of Europe in that same time period. And we're going to be addressing imperialism in Africa and in India and other places, as well as the height of nationalism and its effect on places like Germany unifying and Italy unifying. And that'll be a really interesting unit to see how you all handle that. So usually we end on to a couple of philosophy questions, but this is more of a review episode. So let's go ahead and wrap this up now. I do appreciate everybody, as usual, giving us the support that you have. Remember that we do have a TikTok on here now. We have a YouTube channel. We, of course, have this podcast on Spotify, on Apple, all these other networks. We're trying to build this community slowly over time. And hopefully I can establish a little bit of a community that maybe at some point someday I can monetize what I'm doing a little bit, help my family out. I do have a newborn daughter and a wife that we're trying to kind of make ends meet as well too. And this podcast gives me a way to meet new people, get new ideas, and learn a lot, but also be able to use my degrees and my experience as a teacher for 16 years to share that out with you all. But I can also find flaws in my own teaching and my own gaps of knowledge and then push those forward. So, again, I hope that you all have a great night. And as always, be contagious.